Alright, YouTube, on this day, of course, a police state, martial law, essentially has descended upon the greater Boston area. They're not calling it a police state, they're not calling it martial law, they're simply saying stay in your homes, and by the way, we're going to go door to door, and if you're not there, we're just going to break down the door and search your house anyway. Apparently that isn't really martial law. It's not martial law, it's just looks like it. It's concerning from a libertarian standpoint. It's concerning when the government would do something like this. Of course, you remember, after 9/11, did they search every home in New York City without warrants and break down people's doors and search their homes and apartments? No, of course not. When Dorner was on the loose in the Los Angeles area, they didn't do that. They set up roadblocks and they handled it in not necessarily a reasonable manner, but a normal manner for the police to do. Of course, now you've got a bombing, and you've got one suspect's already dead, and they're so keen on finding the other suspect that they've essentially tossed the right to privacy out the window, telling people you will submit to a full search of your home. It's concerning on one level because they're actually doing it. It makes no sense. It doesn't make sense to search all of these homes. He's probably not in any of them. For one thing, he's probably left the area by now. And it's concerning on the second level because there doesn't seem to be any real outcry against it. The media, by and large, has sat by. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's the conservative media, aka Fox, talk radio, or the liberal media, or anywhere in between. They haven't really covered that aspect of what's going on in Boston right now. All they've said is, well, the police are searching for this suspect. Well, why aren't you covering the aspect of, well, people are having their homes invaded without, by the way, a properly issued warrant? There has been at least one case where a reporter had a gun shoved in their face and was told essentially no interviewing witnesses, which violates the First Amendment. You've got all of these things happening right now, and it makes you wonder if there's something larger going on at this location. Of course, there were individuals who seemed to be part of an organization known as Craft International in the crowd at the Boston Marathon, not far from the blast area. Craft International, of course, is like Blackwater. It's basically trainees. They're mercenaries, essentially. They're people who the government would hire to go kill people in other countries, or to police the streets because they're not due to the same restrictions that the actual military and police are due to follow, because they're essentially a private organization. They're a business, in other words. They make money off of killing and harassing people. They're thugs, essentially. No media outlets covering this, and there doesn't even seem to be widespread outrage that this is happening. I find it slightly humorous, almost, that it's happening in Boston. Now, before you take anything away from that, I say humorous for this reason. During the Revolutionary period, Boston, of course, was the hotbed of revolutionary sentiment, and you had, of course, the British soldiers sort of confiscating people's guns, going door to door to search for these revolutionaries, making sure people were in line, doing things people didn't want them to do. And, of course, the revolution, like any revolution, was never a popular revolution. It took place amongst a small minority of the population that was actually willing to fight, the remaining majority of the population not really giving a shit. So I find that slightly funny, that Boston is almost repeating the same sentiments of 1776 at this very moment. But it's concerning that these things are happening. Also, and this is something that people don't necessarily know, there's no real legal recourse for these individuals by having their homes invaded. It's a blatant disregard for the Constitution. It is unconstitutional. Any reasonable individual would interpret it that way. Any reasonable judge would interpret it that way. It's a violation of people's privacy. And they seem to be violating the rights of the press as well, to some extent. So it's in violation of the Constitution. What's slightly odd is that, and I learned this several days ago. I didn't know this before, and everyone should know this. We've been in a perpetual state of emergency, and that has its own, and I'll explain, meaning behind it, since 9/11. That is that the state of emergency that was declared on September the 11th, 2001 by Bush never actually went away. We've been in a state of emergency for 12 years now, non-stop. Obama has renewed it several times. That state of emergency never went away. What does this mean? It means that the government, under that state of emergency, unless the president nullifies it or the Congress nullifies it, has the right to censor things to a greater degree, has the right to ban organizations to a greater degree, has the right to confiscate public property to a greater degree. Most of the things that you've seen since 9/11, which were obviously unconstitutional. You see, of course, the government taking people's land and giving it to private businesses while paying pennies to the owner. You see the gun grabbing after Hurricane Katrina that everyone whined so much about. You see what's happening now in Boston. You see censorship of the press. You see censorship of the internet, attempted censorship in some cases. You see these things happening. They're happening partially because the federal government right now is almost running unrestrained. Right now, the federal government, because we're technically in that same state of emergency that we've been in since I was in middle school, which is long ago and makes no sense to me, the government is no longer, it's run over the banks of its own riverbed, so to speak. This top-down sort of statist government that we have right now. And I'm not an uber-libertarian individual. I lean left on the environmental issues. I do believe in the government controlling corporations to some extent. And I do believe the government should restore law and order in cases where things like this happen. But it's concerning the degree to which they're ignoring the Constitution, which essentially, like I said, under that state of emergency is essentially null and void. The Defense Authorization Act, all of these things that you see, the use of mercenaries, the use of drones, are perfectly allowed, and it's not even clear whether Congress understands that we're still under that state of emergency. You got to realize most of the people in Congress weren't there on September 11th. Most of the people in Congress are newer than that, or I would say a large section of the Congress post-dates that time period. It's not clear they even understand that a state of emergency exists and that their own power is somewhat less until they collectively vote to nullify it. And it would be good if they did that, by the way. There's no reason, when people are afraid, they lose track of the fact that they're free. When people are injected with fear, or with bigotry, or with, any of these things that happen in the world that make people feel less secure, they're willing to give up their freedom. But Benjamin Franklin said it best, those who are willing to give up essential liberty for temporary security deserve neither. And they're going to get neither. These people in Boston don't seem to understand, or maybe they understand and there's just such a lockdown on communication it hasn't seeped out to the mainstream media yet, that their rights are being violated. There's no legitimate reason why they should be going door to door over such a wide area when the chances that this individual has barged into a home without the neighbors noticing and potentially harmed people without being caught is very low. It's much more likely that he fled somehow by foot, by bike, maybe he stole a police car, who knows, and he's not even in the area. Now, there are also reports of gunfire around the city. What are these people shooting at? There have been reports that they're grabbing people's firearms. That's not clear. It's probably not true, but there are reports that that is possibly the case. And we probably wouldn't know because there's a mainstream media blackout. Fox, at 5 o'clock today, half the streams went down. The scanner streams are down. Some of the live broadcasts on the street online are down anyway for CNN, whatever. And the whole situation just reeks of corruption. It makes absolutely no sense. But the primary thing people need to remember is that just because they have rights enumerated under the Constitution doesn't mean they don't have to fight for those rights from time to time. Of course, the Founding Fathers evolved out of a time period where they were fighting their own government. Another thing people don't understand, they think, well, the Americans fought off the British. No, the British fought off the British. They were still British at the time. They had declared independence. It didn't mean anything to the British government that they declared independence. They still saw them as citizens. They were fighting their own government during the Revolutionary period. And people don't understand that. They don't understand that just because a document gives you rights doesn't mean that those rights will be respected. The government has the military behind them. They have the police. They have the guns. They have the tanks. They have the bombs and drones. They have the media essentially in their pocket, and anyone who thinks that the mainstream media reports fairly is deluding themselves, regardless of what mainstream media source they're using. I had one person from Russia suggest to me that actually people should use media sources outside of their own country just to get a less biased view, which is sometimes truthful in the case, sometimes not. But right now, what you have is an authoritarian government, essentially, flexing its power. It almost seems like they're waiting to see if people will react to these events and say this is too top-heavy, this is too much liberty is being taken with the Constitution, we're not comfortable with that. Not even people rising up and rioting, but just people pointing out, this doesn't feel right to us. It almost feels like they're testing the waters. And of course, there were reports that there were supposedly bomb drills going on the time and bomb-sniffing dogs at the marathon itself, which makes absolutely no sense. The entire thing is a big clusterfuck. Nobody's sure what the hell's going on in Watertown or Boston right now. Nobody has a clue. And it's a clusterfuck. Nobody's got any clue what's going on in there because things are so locked down. It is literally, in the most literal sense of the term, martial law. There are soldiers on the street. People are being forced to comply with their orders to search their homes. That's martial law. There's no other term to use for it, and they can use whatever term they want. It still equates to that same principle that, yes, you are under the law of the military currently and of the police. Your rights are suspended. That's a fact. They can use whatever term they want. That's like calling these bombers terrorists. Well, terrorist is essentially an arbitrary, concocted term to differentiate between those who are foreign, originally at 9/11, foreign fighters who came to bomb things, and now it's being applied to domestic sources in an attempt to remove their constitutional rights and give them military tribunal trials rather than civilian trials, which are actually fair and guarantee that you can talk to the outside world. And it's hideous. It's the hideous face of tyranny we're seeing right now. What's not clear, and we may not know this for days or weeks or even months, is whether this heightened level of security, this sort of military state that's been slowly revving up around the country, is going to go away, or whether it's going to persist and grow larger. And if it persists and spreads and grows larger, we've got a problem on our hands. The problem of, oh look, Uncle Sam is searching through your backyard. Are you growing any marijuana plants back here? We better dig up your self-sustaining garden. Well, do you have guns in the home? Well, you better let us take a look. By the way, we're looking through your emails right now. That's not the America that I want to live in. That's not the America that the Founding Fathers suggested we should create. It's not the one they envisioned for the future. Surely, we know that to be the case. You can look through their personal correspondence and you can understand they were largely distrustful of the government, even when they were as the government themselves, and deliberately put limits on it for that reason, because they understood the one defining principle at work is that power will corrupt. And it will. And you see it. It doesn't matter what party the person belongs to. Bush, Obama, same difference essentially. Obama is marginally more coherent and actually has the capability of putting two sentences together without making some hideous blundering error and making an ass of himself on television. But they have basically the same ideas, and that state of emergency, as I said before, has persisted through most of the Bush years, and has persisted through all of Obama's years. and probably will persist longer than that, which is unacceptable in a supposedly free and liberated society, which is structured around representative democracy. Sort of the idea of the fall of Rome, the fall of Greece, democracy slowly turns into tyranny and everyone sort of gets fucked in the ass, which is sad. Nobody wants to live in that sort of Blade Runner-esque dystopian future, but nobody is willing to speak out against these things when they happen. And of course, people make their own choice, and I think that the latter is worse, between peaceful and violent revolution. Peaceful revolution generally gets more people on your side and is more effective in the long run for addressing things like this. I think these individuals that supposedly, and it's not clear whether they actually did orchestrate these bombings, chose the latter route, unfortunately, towards actually harming civilians, and thus their public image is ruined. Nobody cares what happens to them. They could crucify them on a telephone pole, nobody would give a shit. And it makes also those of us who do stand for more limited government look bad as well, because then people start to suspect us and say, are you going to flip out with a gun? Are you going to start building bombs? Are you going to do something crazy, essentially? Which most libertarians would not do. And Fox is already blaming it on Muslim extremism without any clue what religion these people happen to have. I mean, the younger dude who's still on the run supposedly has pictures of, like, cats and shit on his Twitter and his Facebook. He doesn't seem like a Muslim reactionary. That could change. It could be the case and be truth, but it's not clear. But anyway, Boston, Watertown, martial law, it's concerning. People should speak out against this. I don't know why there isn't an outcry in at least the right-wing media. Usually, people like Stossel on Fox usually point these things out when a Democrat's in charge, and then when the Republicans are in charge, like under Bush, you have MSNBC and Olbermann ranting about these things.